Let's go ahead with the analysis of the 5 wounds of the Church. For Rosmini, the first wound, the wound of the left hand of the Holy Church, is the division between people and clergy at public worship. The second wound is the wound of the right hand, the insufficient education of the clergy. The third wound, the wound of the side of the Holy Church, is the disunion amongst the bishops. The first one of the right foot is the nomination of bishops left in the hands of civil government. And in the end, the last wound, the wound of the left foot, is the restrictions on free use by the Church of their own temporalities. It would be worthy to analyze every one of these 5 wounds in its depthness, in the way in which they anticipate central and core intuitions of the Second Vatican Council. Now, in our case, in which we are interested in the anticipation which Rosmini had on some themes which are central for Pope Francis, evidently we focus on the last wound, the wound of the left foot, restrictions on free use by the Church of her own temporalities. Here Rosmini faces the challenge of poverty and the spiritual interpretation of poverty. What does Rosmini write in this last chapter of this work? In paragraph 130 we read, "There is no doubt that feudalism, if not the sole source of all the Church's ills, was by far the most important factor of their origin." So the last wound, which is not the central wound is the disunion of bishops, which we will analyze after when we are talking about the collegiality, also this central theme of Pope Francis. But the last one, which in a certain way reassumes all the wounds, all the problems, all the crises, or the institutional crisis of Church, is that Church is depending on logics which are not the spiritual logics of her essence. Church is depending on items, on necessities, which do not result of their own essence, of their own mission, of that what she has to announce, the gospel. And Rosmini is reassuming this dependency by the word feudalism, by the word false richness. This is not all of the problems, but this is the most important one. It was a system. What is feudalism for Rosmini? It was a system dependent upon the pagan lordship of the barbarians, combined with bond service and vassalage towards temporal rulers. Feudalism, we can say, it's a conception of medieval church. So what does feudalism has to do with the problems of today, with the problems of recent crisis of Church? Yes, feudalism is institutional asset of Church which is not given anymore. But feudalism for Rosmini does mean very, very much more than only an institutional question. It is the dependence of Church which makes sure that the Church cannot announce anymore in a convincible sense, it's her own essence. In a concrete way, obviously, feudalism was the dependency, the barbarian, the pagan dependency, the dependency of people, of vassalage, of people from their lords. And this lordship was a system which based social power personally. The owner of social power was a person who makes dependent on herself other persons by vassalage, by a social system of dependencies between people. And these dependencies are realizations of political power. So the people who stand on the upper grade, on the downer grades, are dependent from then ones of the upper grades, and not only in an administrative sense, and not only in a democratic sense, but they are dependent on a personal, on a political, on a juridical, on an existential sense. So we have the situation that in medieval societies, or the existence of people which are on downer grades is depending on people on upper grades. We have not the institution of individual rights, of subjective rights. We have not the affirmation of the principle of the fundamental equality of all people. People are defined about their social differences, are defined through their social dependencies. And this is a spirit, this is a vision of society, which said Rosmini, which is fundamentally against the spirit of Christianity. And if this spirit against Christianity has also come into church, and not only has determined the thinking of Christians, but it has also formed the institutional aspect of church, then church has become dependent on a social reason which is not the original reason of Christianity. We can say more. It is a social reason that Christianity, in its original sense, wanted to overcome, wanted to reform, wanted to abolish. But this did not have place until the French Revolution, when this type of society was not overcome firstly within the church, but within society. And this is for Rosmini and also for other thinkers, let's say Hegel and other ones, an interesting aspect that Christian spirit has become politically reformed. Christian spirit which came into the world as a non-political issue. Jesus said, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's." So it was a non-politically mission, a non-politic announcement, had caused the most revolutionary political consequences, which are in the end realized paradoxically against church, paradoxically against Christian culture, paradoxically against Christian tradition by French Revolution. French Revolution realized one thing, beside their anti-clerically, their anti-ecclesiastical, their anti-Christian effects, but they realized one original Christian intuition, the fundamental equality of all persons, because all persons are sons and daughters of the same divine Father. And if these principles in the French Revolution are formulated against church, we can talk about a certain cultural paradox. A cultural paradox which for Rosmini seemed one of the most fundamental paradoxes in all the history, we can say. And Rosmini, besides criticizing evidently the French Revolution for many aspects, for many anti-Christian aspects, for also its violent, its terroristic aspects, for its aspects that it does not formulate the democratic exigency of the equality of all people in a right political way, because for Rosmini the absolute democracy is not the most original, the most authentic realization of the idea of the universal equality of all people. Besides these aspects, Rosmini could realize, in a certain sense, valorize in the French Revolution this positive aspect. And very, very interestingly, we find this aspect, this positive interpretation of the French Revolution in his work on the reform of the church, in the Five Wounds. In other works, Rosmini is speaking very, very critically about the French Revolution. Rosmini, I would say, most of all the times is criticizing very, very, very strongly, very hardly the French Revolution. He is contrasting French Revolution whenever he can. But incidentally, in the Five Wounds, in the work in which he is talking about the revolution, the spiritual revolution of church, spiritual reform, not revolution, the spiritual reform of church, he is quoting the French Revolution as also, not only, but as also having positive aspects. And the very, very positive aspect is overcoming the feudal constitution of society. This overcoming the feudal constitution of society is a far spiritually effect of Christianity, of the Christian revolution of society, which begins with a revolution, a spiritual revolution of person, which becomes then a revolution of society, and then the political revolution of 1776 and 1789, and which has to be received by church and by the church authorities in a positive sense, in the sense that also church, who has to be in a certain sense the institution who firstly realizes the very social aspects of the Christian announcement. In this moment, church has realized a certain historical delay, because first political society realized this aspect, and then only church. Rosmini wanted to begin a social and a spiritual reform of church, which would make possible that in future church can anticipate social reforms, that church can be a positive aspect, can be an example for society. And if we read rightly Pope Francis, we maybe can individuate in his speeches, in his signs, in his announcements, this exigency that church has to renew, to reform herself, to get for new an example for society. And when we read and when we see Pope Francis acting very, very much within the church, he is very, very sorrowed about the problems of church. He is very active in reforming church's structures. And someone is saying Pope Francis does not have a social ethical reflection. Pope Francis for now does not inside in society, does not act on the reform of society. He is underlining the importance to help the poor, but he is not such as active on the social ethical reflection as his predecessors were. This is only a superficial judgment on Pope Francis. And why it is a superficial judgment? We can see this in Rosmini, because Rosmini says the reflection of the reform of the church is the first point, is the core point of the reflection of the reform of society. In the reflection of church, we can see the principles. The reflection of the reform of church gives us the principles for having then the principles also which we can contribute to the question how we have to reform society. So let's go on the quotation of the 5 wounds, on the last wound, the 5th one. Feudalism was so this system of pagan vassalage. As a lordship, it divided the clergy from the people. Feudalism divides people, the one from the others, because feudalism is declining power as political power as personal power. If political power is identified, none with structures, none with administration, none with democratic and formal structures, not with political offices in which a person is acting in service on the others. But if political power is identified with persons, then it does not conciliate persons, but it does divide them. And this is the spirit of feudalism. And Rosmini said, the main problem of church is if this spirit is pervading church, if this spirit is determining church. And we can read the same thing also in Pope Francis, because Pope Francis said that and he said it in he's responding to the director Scalfari, and also in its interview with Spadaro, he says that the Christian faith is only authentic if it creates society, if it creates relationship between people. The Christian truth, he said in a letter to the non-believer Scalfari, the Christian truth is the truth of a personal truth, is truth of relationship, because it does not create an individual person which is then convinced about the truth, and convinced about this truth he is dividing himself from the others, considering the others as them who are in error, who has false positions, who are living in error. But it is creating dialogue, it is creating relationship. He said, and this is the theme why, and this is the ground why Pope Francis here is speaking about truth in relationship. And the concrete quotation is, I would not speak about absolute truths even for believers, in the sense that absolute is that which is disconnected and bereft of all relationship. As Rosmini says, the material richness, political power, does not have to create individuals which are considering themselves as better than the others, as politically upon the others, as exercising political power on the others. Pope Francis is also saying that the illusion of possessing the truth, the intellectual power, can have the consequence that people are dividing themselves of the others, that they are conceiving themselves as individuals who detain, who have the truth. And this does not found a concrete communion, a concrete relationship, a concrete society of church. But this does create division. And this does create division not only in the church, but also in the relationship of the church with the others. And therefore also in the social dimension and in the social responsibility of the church herself. Truth, according to the Christian faith, said Pope Francis, is the love of God for us in Jesus Christ. Therefore, truth is a relationship. As such, each one of us receives the truth and expresses it from within, that is to say, according to one's own circumstances, culture and situation in life, etc. This does not mean that truth is a variable and subjective. Quite the contrary. Quite the contrary. Pope Francis does not want to subjectivize truth. This we will consider in the second part of these lectures. But it does signify that it comes to us always and only as a way and a life. Did not Jesus himself say, "I am the way, the truth, and the life"? In other words, truth, being completely one with love, demands humility and an openness to be sought, received, and expressed. Therefore, we must have a correct understanding of the terms, and perhaps in order to overcome being bogged down by conflicting absolute positions, we need to redefine the issues in depth. I believe this is absolutely necessary in order to initiate the peaceful and constructive dialogue which I proposed at the beginning of my letter. So, in a certain way, we can see here the formulation of an intellectual feudalism. If Rosmini considered, evidently in the last wound of the church, the feudalism of richness, here we are considering the feudalism, the intellectual feudalism, and we see another time the universal understanding of poverty which Pope Francis has, the universal understanding of richness, of false richness, which Pope Francis has, and that church is answering to the intellectual poverty of society, not by underlining that it owns the absolute truth. This would be an intellectual feudalism, which does not create dialogue, which does not redeem the others, which does not exercise intellectual charity. So we can see that, putting together the Rosminian and the Rosminian point of view with the one of Pope Francis, we can see that on the one hand we can widen, we can actualize the concepts of Rosmini, and on the other side we can find the more deep, the more authentic dimensions of that what the intuitions and the thoughts of Pope Francis are. Given this premise, and this is fundamental, that the mercy of God is limitless for those who turn to Him with the sincere and contrite heart, the issue for the unbelievable lies in obeying his or her conscience. There is sin even for those who have no faith, when conscience is not followed. So, in this way, to follow the conscience, to have a new dialogue with the other, we have in this way a new way in which Church is proposing herself in a spiritually renewed way according to the others. And to this dimension, what this does mean now for the dimension of conscience, we turn afterwards. Let's now follow to read the Rosminian text. We are always in the paragraph 130 of the Five Wounds. So, the problem is the division of clergy from the people. From the people not only of Church, we can say with Pope Francis, from all of the people. We have to overcome this division. Then Rosmini proceeds. It also split the clergy themselves into upper and lower classes, substituting for the ties between father and son the dissensions of ruler and subject. As a result, clerical education was neglected. Rosmini himself does recognize that the division in upper and lower classes, the introduction of feudalism, of political power into Church, does hinder, does obstacle the intellectual and the cultural mission of Church, because it obstacles the real educative dimension. The problem that we have to educate the clergy, that we have to educate all the Christians in the way that they can realize intellectual charity to all the others. And divisions emerged, says Rosmini, amongst the bishops who formed the upper clergy. Devotion to their own rights of lordship and those of the rulers whose vassals they were led to neglect of their brotherhood, separation from the people, and detachment from the body of the episcopate. So this problem of feudalism introduced the divisions also from one bishop to the other. And we see afterwards that in the exigency to renew the collegiality of Church, of Pope Francis, we have here the answer of Pope Francis to this analysis of the third wound of Rosmini. As bound service, feudalism made bishops, its fields and liegement, personal subjects of the temporal lord. The Church and all it possessed what that thus chained ignominiously of the chariot of lay power and dragged wherever temporary policies dictated. So the Church come under the dictation and the power of the political society, which were identified with the power of the kings and of the principals. Exhausted and effectively robbed of all the endowments she had received, the Church was incapable even of keeping and defending the nomination of her own pastors. So the problem that the nomination of the pastors, of the bishops, were not determined by spiritual principles, but by principles of political power. This, in this direct sense, which Rosmini was criticizing, today is not anymore the case. But we can see that some of these logics are determining also today the nomination of bishops, of priests, and of others. And here we have to underline that in a certain sense, a reform of Church has to ground newly on spiritual principles. And we see just in the first nominations of Pope Francis, like of the Secretary of State, Monsignor Paulin and others, we see that Pope Francis does not want to follow anymore principles like power, principles like groups, like influences, which stand behind persons. But he wants to choose persons on the base of new principles, which possibly have to be the spiritual principles of Church. So the principles of personal poverty, spiritual poverty, of the principle of spiritual life of the persons, and of intellectual honesty, of education, intellectual education, and very many other principles which are not the principles of political power. Let's now go ahead. Rosmini, which in the paragraph 130 reassumed, as we saw, the other wounds, the other four wounds of Church, now comes into the core thought of the fifth wound. The fifth wound, which is the restrictions on free use by the Church of her own temporalities. And Rosmini said, the early Church was poor but free. And here we have to consider also what we said about the social ethical dimension of poverty, which is not only material poverty. Church does not have to become spiritually poor to be free, but she has to reform herself on the principles of spiritual poverty to become newly free. Persecution did not deprive her of freedom of government, nor did the violent appropriation of her possessions damage her true liberty. In the first Church, we dealt evidently with material poverty and with political persecution. She was free of vassalage and enforced protection. She was no man's ward and paid no compulsory legal fees. But restrictions on the use of church temporalities were introduced by conditions which made it impossible for the church to maintain her own traditional standards in the acquisition, administration, and use of material benefits. So we can say the Constantinian epoch of church, which began with the Emperor Constantine and in the centuries after Constantine, in which church became an official institution of the Roman Empire, and this becoming a political dimension made real, says Rosmini, that in the acquisition, administration, and use of material benefits, church did not follow anymore her original and traditional spiritual standards, but she applied temporal standards of political standards. And if now we are talking about the end of Constantinian epoch of church, the end which was signed by the Second Vatican Council, and which we can define finished in the way that the principles of Second Vatican Council are realized. And as we can analyze the statements of Pope Francis, he is insisting on a more intensive realization of the principle of the Second Vatican Council. So on the end of this Constantine epoch, this does not mean that church does not have to have any social doctrine, that she does not have to have any social institutions like hospitals, like other social institutions, that she does not have to influence on politics, on world politics, on the questions of peace or war in the world and other issues. But this does mean that church has to rethink her position in these influences. These influences are not anymore institutionally predisposed, are not anymore based on an institutionally a priori. This a priori with the end of Constantine epoch is not given anymore. And church has to rethink about the question, what is the new basis of this influence? And this new basis, as we read here in Rosmini, and as we can also analyze in Pope Francis, are that principles which had elaborated even the early church. The early church, which was poor, and which in this poverty elaborated the spiritual principles of how to acquire, administrate, and use material benefits. And the actual church has not to give away all these material benefits, but she has to rethink about how to use them and how to exercise its social ethical influence also on political institutions. And Rosmini finishes this paragraph saying, as she gradually declined from these standards, which served to neutralize the corrupting and illusory aspects of temporalities, she was threatened by increasing danger. Not only that church was threatened by the danger, as we can see here, she did not even have anymore the capacity to influence the society, because adopting the feudal principles, the influence of church, the reform power of church, the very power which with church can influence, can make sure that social reforms are realized, are, as Rosmini says, neutralized. And to let come out the principles, the social ethical principles of church from its neutralization, to rediscover their social incidence, their social power, their social importance, the five wounds of the church and the reform aspects of Pope Francis have to be considered as central. Thank you very much for following this course, and in the next lesson we analyze any more other paragraphs of the five Wund of the Church, and passing then to the other aspects, social ethical aspects of a Rosminian reading of the new Pope. Thank you very much.